Hello and welcome to another edition of Redleg Roundtable. We are a part of the Riverfront on the Blue Wire Network, and I am so pleased today to welcome Mike Koser from Lost Ballparks. Mike, thanks so much.
Hey, thanks for having me. By the way, I love your T-shirt. You got a little Crosley field going there.
Well, yeah, we were going to talk about that. This is the first night game tee, a company called Homage here in Columbus, Ohio, where I live. They're throughout, baseball and football and NBA as well and things like that. But they made this. It's got the first night game there from May 24th, 1935, was held in Crosley Field.
Yeah, I've got the exact same shirt. So.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, I was telling you before we came on the air, I first discovered you on Instagram. You were on there under the tag Lost Ballparks, all one word. And you would post, fan submitted photos of ballparks gone by. In fact, actually, over the time, let's see, this was back in 2022. I have one that you posted that I sent in. My grandfather taking a picture of Pete Rose on camera day at Crosley Field, which meant that the fans could go out on the field and take pictures of their favorite players. And so you posted that one as well as one or two others I sent in. So that's how I got to know who you were.
Yeah, right on. Well, thanks for sending those in. I mean, that is a huge help. And honestly, some of the best photographs are the candid ones, not shot by professional photographers, but sent in by folks like you who people have never seen before, So I love those photos. Yeah.
And my grandfather,
I remember that one too.
Yeah, my grandfather, he would take these pictures. He always complained that they made them shoot toward the sun. They put the fans out there, and then the players would come out from the dugout area, and he said you had to shoot toward the sun. Now, I went in and did some doctoring of that photo, so it wasn't quite as washed out. But, yeah, it's the original photo, and his favorite player at that time was Gordy Coleman. And so he has a photo of, much like the one of Pete, of Gordy Coleman up on his wall.
That's great. I love that.
And they were taken on slides as well. So that,
right.
That's.
Yeah.
But hey, tell me a little bit about Lost Ballparks, how it came to be. I was looking on your website a little bit, same name, lostballparks.com. I just wanted to hear a little bit about how that came to be for you. It's a great kind of culling of information of old time ballparks.
Yeah. So I've always loved history. And I remember in college, my wife, who was then my girlfriend, for a Christmas present, got me a book called Lost Ballparks. I mean, this was like 30 years ago. And I started combing through it. And I'm like, man, these fields are so incredible. Looking at places like Crosley Field and Ebbets Field and the Polo Grounds where the New York Giants played. And I quickly just fell in love with that and began to study it over the course of the next decade or two. And then, when Facebook kind of came along, I started posting photos with some details about these old ballparks that used to be a part of Major League Baseball. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to post these for me. And I don't care if anybody likes it or not. I'm just going to kind of post them. But it turns out a lot of people were interested in the same thing that I was. And over the course of time, just kind of grew a following on Facebook and then branched off into Instagram and then Twitter. And then I was out to lunch with a couple of friends of mine who said to me, you should do a podcast, like bring these ballparks to life. And we can begin to flush out the idea of, okay, well, what would that podcast look like? What would it sound like? Who would we have on? And they're like, you know what? You should get players, find broadcasters who were there, season ticket holders, clubhouse managers. And so I said, yeah, let's go for it. I mean, and that's really how the podcast began a couple of years ago.
Let me ask you a question. I was listening to either XM radio or a podcast recently, and there was a voiceover. Sounded a lot like you. Do you do some voiceover work?
Yeah. So I was involved in radio and TV for maybe 20 years. And then that sort of transitioned into me building I don't think you can see it, but building a studio in my house. And I started doing commercial voiceovers. So yeah, in addition to what I do with Lost Ballparks, that my day job is voiceovers. So yeah,
that's great. That's great. Yeah. It's funny. I have a neighbor around the block here, and his son is in my son's grade. And one morning I woke up and I turned on a podcast, or actually it was maybe around bedtime. I had it in my ear, and I all of a sudden I hear Brandon. I'm like, why is my neighbor talking to me through my podcast? And he was doing a voiceover.
Oh, that's so great.
He's a local radio personality here in town. So that was pretty funny. But then not long after that, I heard yours. So as I was preparing for this podcast today, this interview, I was thinking about, what is it that makes baseball ballparks, baseball stadiums kind of stand out to us as real diehard baseball fans? And certainly there are people who remember old football stadiums hey, I went to Ohio State. Behind me here is Ohio Stadium where Ohio State football plays. That's a real IO, baby.
All
IO.
right.
All right. Yeah, you grew up in Cleveland, I guess, didn't you?
Yeah, just south of there. Yeah.
But so for the most part, especially NFL stadiums, for the most part, we really romanticize baseball ballparks. We don't always just call them stadiums either. And I was thinking about the George Carlin sketch where he talks about football being, and then baseball's in a walk in the park and all that.
Right.
Can you verbalize kind of what drew you? And you talked about the book already, but that you got from your now wife. But verbalize for me a little bit about why you think baseball ballparks are so much more a part of the fabric of the sport.
Yeah, first of all, I will tell you, if you get a second, listen to the Bob Costas episode, because we asked that question of him at the very front, and he gives a way more articulate answer that I'm about to give you, and it's just really beautifully put. So if you get a chance, check out that Bob Costas episode. But for me, I would say this, and I can't speak for everybody, but I just know that when I would go to a game with my dad at Municipal Stadium in Cleveland, there was an hour drive up, there was an hour drive back, and then about 2.5 hours at the ballpark with him. And I had his undivided attention. So for me, sitting in the ballpark, it wasn't like this loud wall of noise that we have today, or that you might have at a football game. There was this opportunity to really sit with your dad and your grandpa and your brothers and sisters and just have conversations about the game and all the attendant history that goes along with it. So for me, I think that's where the special connection is with baseball as opposed to football or basketball. And then all these ballparks were so unique and different. You look back at Ebbets Field and they had the Schaefer beer scoreboard where the H and the word Schaefer would light up for a hit and the E would light up for an error, or the Polo Grounds where the clubhouses were all the way out in center field, which felt like a mile away. They all had their own thumbprint, their own fingerprint, right? And football stadiums and basketball arenas all pretty much look the same. They all kind of feel the same. But there was a uniqueness about ballparks, especially back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And maybe we're getting back to that now, that you won't find in other sports.
Well, and I was going to say that as well. Certainly the cookie cutter stadiums, I'm not going to say ruin that for baseball a little bit, but because that's the funny thing too. I grew up with Riverfront Stadium, and the joke is with my friends, it was a dump, but it was our dump, and
right.
And you walk down underground, it's just this dank, wet concrete smell, and you go out to your seats. But we had the different colored seats. It was the only place you could go and say if you had a blue seat ticket, boy, you were down low and you had good seats. You know what I mean? It went blue, green, yellow, and then red.
And listen, say what you want about Riverfront, but I will tell you that when I was a kid and we would drive from Mansfield, Ohio down to Florida for vacation, we passed two major league ballparks. The first was Riverfront, which was off of 75 or 71.
Well, actually, 71 directly, but 75 and 71 come together right near the ballpark.
Right. Yeah. So we would drive by Riverfront, and man, as a little kid, you're looking at that ballpark and thinking that's where Johnny Bench plays. Maybe he's there now. And then the other one was in Atlanta at Fulton County Stadium. We would drive by there and I would think, okay, Dale Murphy is in there doing his thing right now. And, so I know they were concrete donuts and, we exchanged Crosley Field for Riverfront, but they still had a special place for me anyway.
Sure.
And I'm sure for you too. Yeah.
Well, and I was born 9 years after Crosley closed, so I never got to be there. My grandpa, though, and actually the picture I'm looking at now that you posted for us of Pete down at Crosley Field, he would talk about, especially the lean years, you could go and get a ticket really low. And he and his friends would drive 3.5 hours to get there from Southeast Ohio. And they would get there and they'd sit right on the rail. And I'm looking at this picture, and somebody commented in your comments, I mean, there's a little gate, a little fence that's maybe 2 feet high. and it's
Right.
grass, gate, and then seat. And I mean, just to be able to watch a game right there would have been amazing, like to be that on top of the action.
Well, and think about this at Crosley Field, the clubhouses were behind the grandstand on the third base side. So the players had to actually walk through the stands. I mean, think about that to get to the clubhouse. And as they're passing by, fans are giving them a high five, congratulating them on the game, telling them happy birthday. I had fans who were at the games say that they would make birthday cakes for Johnny Bench and other players and hand them to him on their way in and out of the ballpark. And there's no other place like that.
Sure. No, not at all. And well, it was funny. You mentioned a minute ago, the Polo Grounds, and they would literally walk kind of out to center field, right?
Yeah.
I was going to tell you, I'm going to tell you about this thing that I did during the pandemic myself. We all kind of seem to have had projects. Okay. And my grandfather and I go to opening day for the Reds. It's a holiday in Cincinnati. We would go every year. I went every year from 95 until the pandemic. And my grandpa was there all but 2 of those years. And then my son, Joey, he was born in 2010. He started coming with us in 2017. So 2020 hits. We don't know what's going to happen. All of a sudden, the pandemic causes, hey, we're not going to have opening day. And so I sat there. I was watching Ken Burns baseball, and I saw Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth, like these film of them playing, and I was inspired. And I said, okay, I'm going to write something for my son. And that's pretty much all the further it's gone. A few friends have read it as well, but basically, the morning of opening day, we wake up, and all of a sudden, we're actually not home anymore. We're in 1925 New York. And we're going to go see Lou Gehrig start his first game. He had played the day before. He's going to start his first game of the streak.
Yeah.
And so I did this where we woke up a different place every day, a different time and place. And one of them I wanted to share with you because you talk about going up to Municipal Stadium in Cleveland. So I woke up one day, and we wake up together, and it's Joe DiMaggio's 56th game of the streak, right? And I did all this research on all these. Shibe Park. I even talked to a professor who wrote a book about it. But I was blown away that they had built Municipal Stadium back years earlier to try to get the Olympics and things like that. But the Indians didn't want to. They didn't want to play there all the time. So at that point, they weren't playing there on weekday games. So DiMaggio actually broke his last game, the 56th game, was actually in League Park, which was blocks away there in downtown Cleveland. And the next night they played a Municipal because they had the lights. So I'm not a Cleveland fan, but I even talked to a few friends who are pretty big fans, and I don't think they realized that. That was amazing to me that they would play at both stadiums.
You know, what's crazy too is a lot of people don't realize that the old ticket house for League Park still stands. And it's about 6 miles from the current ballpark. They kind of redid that area. And it's beautiful now, but if you love history, it's worth a visit because I also believe that Babe Ruth's 500th home run was at League Park. So in addition to the Joe DiMaggio history,
Wow, that's amazing. And so one of the other days was we woke up and we were there for the catch, the 1954 World Series, right? So we're in the Polo Grounds, and you always see the film of the huge batter's eye, right? And he goes almost to the wall and he catches it. Well, you can see fans just to the right as we look at from home plate, just to the right of the catch. These fans are right by that batter's eye. So I had us put right there. So we got to sit there.
Great.
As I described it. Yeah. And then my son got to go play stickball with Willie Mays out in the street. It was kind of a fun little thing for him. But I like to tell him that he got to do or whatever. But yeah, the visuals, even having never, Polo Grounds have been gone long before I was it was still there when I was born maybe. But I'd never been there. But you see the video or the film of the stadium, you can just picture it, can't you?
Yeah, and you talk about uniqueness. I mean, again, at the Polo Grounds, you had, I think it was like 279 feet. It was like a chip shot down the left field line, but it was almost 500 feet to straightaway center field where the clubhouses were. And this last week, we had a guest on the podcast who actually lived at the Polo Grounds with his family. His dad, Matty Schwab, whose his dad was actually the Crosley Field groundskeeper, right?
Okay.
But Matty was the groundskeeper at the Polo Grounds, and they built an apartment for him underneath the left field stands. So here's this kid who's able to have sleepovers and put up tents in the center field, right where you're talking about where Willie Mays made that catch, and he actually lived there.
That's amazing. And even in 51, when Bobby Thompson hit the home run, the swarm of people out as they tried to get to the clubhouse, just all that stuff is just so amazing. Just so amazing.
Billy Williams, who was a member of the Chicago Cubs and is in the Baseball Hall of Fame, played at the Polo Grounds, and he said when you would after the game, you would go up those seats in center field toward your clubhouse, but there were fans on either side. He goes, you had to grab your hat and put it in your pocket, otherwise fans would reach over and grab your hat and take it.
Well, and there's a famous picture of Ralph Branca sprawled out on the stairs. That's probably more hidden back behind there, but yeah, he was there where he gave up the home run.
Ralph gave up that home run or that pitch. He threw the ball that Bobby Thompson put in the left field seats and was just devastated after the game. Carl Erskine, who was our very first guest and a member of that 1955 Brooklyn Dodger team, was there that day and said how difficult it was for Ralph because there was only this thin door that separated both clubhouses.
Oh, wow.
So here you have the Giants celebrating loudly, and Ralph's on the floor, literally on the other side of the door in tears, and he can hear everything that's happening and knowing that he was responsible for that. It was tough.
Wow. Carl Erskine, the pride of Anderson, Indiana.
Right.
Just passed away this past year. Yeah, boy, that would be something. It reminds me, now everything's so intrusive with cameras everywhere. Yesterday, my Cincinnati Bengals lost, and a rookie, a seventh round pick, committed pass interference that allowed the Chiefs to kick the winning field goal, and the cameras zoom in him on the bench, just sitting there dwelling in it. He's sitting in it like, oh my goodness. I was so upset that it happened, but then you can't help but feel awful for the guy.
Right. Yeah.
Well, hey, so I want to take you through a few interviews you've had that are Reds related, and certainly I don't expect you to remember everything you talked about, but I know a few of these names they're standouts to our viewers or listeners, but also I'm sure, like you've already mentioned one man's name, Johnny Bench was one of the guys you got to talk to, and certainly here on Redleg Roundtable, I'm still efforting trying to get him to come on, but you got to speak with him for a little bit, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on, he talked about Crosley and Riverfront, and maybe even some of the places he visited as well.
Yeah, so my favorite story that he tells on that podcast episode was in 72 when he hits that home run in the NLCS, right? As he's walking to the plate, and I believe the Reds were trailing by 1 in the bottom of the 9th inning. He walks to the plate. He hears his mom in the crowd say, you know what you have to do, hit a home run. Yeah. And he does. And it's just a magical moment. It's also funny because you think that these players won't remember things from 40, 50 years ago, but he's still bent that he ended his career with 389 home runs. At Crosley Field, there was a line that went across the outfield, and if you hit the ball above the line at that particular part of the field, it was a home run. Anything below it was not. It was by the scoreboard. And so he hit a ball that he swears went above the line, but Wendelstedt, I think, was the umpire who called it, said it was not a home run. But Johnny still swears that he should have 390 home runs, and the Crosley Field ground rule robbed him of that.
Well, I mean, you think of also Willie Mays having to play at Candlestick as long as he did, and then, I mean, even at Riverfront, the walls were higher. They didn't take him down to 8 feet until about 87 or 88, I don't think. And so I'm sure a few home runs were robbed there as well.
Yeah. And, actually, one of the things that I loved about the Johnny Bench episode is that at the very beginning, he talks about, and this is the great common denominator for all of us who love this game, is that we all have a first. The first Major League Baseball game that we ever went to. And most of us can describe in vivid detail what it was like that day, what it smelled like, what it felt like, what it sounded like. And Johnny Bench is no different. I mean, you think of him like, oh, he's a Major League Baseball player, he's in the Hall of Fame, maybe the greatest catcher of all time. Does he remember that? And yeah, he drove 8 or 9 hours to go see the Cardinals play the Dodgers at Sportsman's Park in St. Louis. And he remembers vividly watching Stan Musial play and Jeff Torborg, who was the catcher that day for the Dodgers. ended up after the game meeting Johnny Bench and giving Johnny Bench, who's a kid just a little kid, his glove, his catcher's glove.
Wow.
What a moment for him. And it's neat to hear Johnny talk about that, because you think of him as this Hall of Famer and he wouldn't be impressed necessarily by anything. But yeah, this moment that he had with Jeff Torborg all those years ago, he still remembers vividly to this day.
Yeah, that is amazing. Actually, let's divert a little bit. Talk about your first Major League Baseball game. Do you still remember that?
Yeah. So I was born in Mansfield, Ohio, but then when I was 5, we moved to Florida. So a lot of between the ages of 5 and 12, 13, 14, I spent a lot of time going to spring training games.
Okay, sure.
In Orlando at Tinker Field, but never really got a chance to go to a Major League game until July of 1988. July 4th, 1988, my dad and my brother and my nephew Gabe, we all went to go watch the Indians play the Oakland A's at Municipal Stadium. And what I remember about that game is that it went to extra innings. I mean, here you are at your first game and you're like, yeah, let's play more.
Yeah, free baseball.
And Mark McGwire, I still remember this towering home run that he hit that landed in the outfield bleachers. They were empty, of course, because it's Cleveland. Nobody was sitting in them, but the ball just ricocheting and bouncing. And I could still hear that sound of what it, reverberating throughout the ballpark. And then being so excited when I got home and listening to Bob Lee on SportsCenter describe that game and thinking, wow, I was just there.
You were there. Yes.
Yeah.
The only time I got to go to Municipal Stadium, I believe, was April or May of 1990. And it was against the Athletics. I wanted to go see the Bash Brothers and Ricky Henderson and all that. We were Reds through and through. My grandparents said, we'll take you and your sister. We'll go up there. And where we grew up, just between Zanesville and Marietta in Ohio, it's, the far southeast portion of the state. When we left that morning at whatever time, 9 a.m., it was already in the 70s. It was warm. My sister and I wear shorts and T-shirts. We drive to Cleveland. We get into the stadium. There's an old-timers game that day that George Foster hit a home run in. Well, that was pretty neat. As a Reds.
Yeah, sure.
Gaylord Perry was there. Boog Powell was there. I remember some of these guys that were there. But we get there. It's 45 degrees, Mike. We left earlier that morning. It was 70, 72.
I'm telling you, you just have the only other place I could think of that was as cold as Municipal Stadium would be Candlestick Park. But
yes.
I mean, Municipal Stadium, it didn't matter what month it was. It could get so frigid. John Miller, who's the voice of the San Francisco Giants, was on the podcast and talking about his early days. I think maybe he was calling games for the Rangers. And so he visited Cleveland and he remembers it being so cold one time that the pitchers and the bullpen grabbed one of the trash cans with all the trash in it, lit it on fire, and were warming their hands out by the bullpen, like only in Cleveland.
Like guys on the street during a Rocky movie as Rocky jogs by.
Exactly.
No, so we get there and they had the rule, obviously, no re-entry. But we got in that stadium and we were so cold that they let my grandpa go back out to the car and get a couple blankets out of the trunk. And like I said, it was Old Timers Day. It's a Saturday. It's the defending World Series champs. And I think there was an announced crowd of 4,500 people.
Yeah. And
here's the funny thing. You remember, so like coming up, it was pretty flat, right? It didn't like come, the lower level was pretty flat. And there were probably 8 to 12 rows maybe. And then there was this really wide walkway.
Oh,
and our seats happened to be in the first row behind that walkway, just barely to the third base side of home plate, like almost directly behind home plate. My grandpa, who loves to have a good quip ready for anything, he said there were 4,500 people there that day, and all of them walked past us about 3 times each. Because we were, you're at the level that they are. So people are walking right in front of you. I remember Ricky Henderson, I think, went 0 for 4. And by the end of the game, I was down by the on-deck circle, and I yelled, "It'll be okay, Ricky." Like Ricky doesn't care.
But that place, you're right. That place was cavernous.
70,000
I don't remember.
seats. Around in there.
And you might have 700 for a day. I can remember being at a game and just wanting to see one of my buddies from high school. I said, "Hey, let's try something." I was on the first base side. I said, "You go to the third base side. Let's see if we can have a conversation." So we literally talked. He could hear what I was saying and I could hear what he was saying. And it made you realize, man, like the players can hear everything because
Yeah.
there is nobody in this ballpark.
Yeah. There's
I
no
mean,
din of, there's no din of
those
like just chatter or anything like that. Yeah.
those years in the
Wow.
70s and 80s, man, it was slim pickings for Indians fans. It was rough.
My grandpa famously never got a foul ball either, going to Crosley or places like that. And at Crosley, you're right on top of it. So he would talk about
Yeah.
how we went one time and down the line, we counted something like a dozen balls in this section. It only had 3 or 4 people in it, and those fans got so many baseballs, but nobody hit it to our section. He said, so the next year when we went, we bought tickets in that section on purpose, and not a one ball came our way. But yeah, but that was interesting, Cleveland. So actually, I got you beat then. My first game was June 18th, 1988 at Riverfront Stadium. And you talk about the smells. We were up in the top. We were way high up in the red seats. We had about probably 6 or 8 of us in our group. So it was, we had to get a little further up. And my memory is the AstroTurf was so green because, we had over-the-air TV and it was not a HD signal, right? So back then, so the AstroTurf looked almost gray on TV, but you get there in person, it looks too green. It's plastic, obviously. And then the red in the Reds hats. I was like, Grandpa, are you sure those aren't the Cardinals? Because that red looks too red to me. Because again, on TV, it didn't look that way.
Yeah,
so
right.
Chris Sabo hit a home run. He was a rookie. He hit a triple, slides into third. The ball gets away from third baseman Kevin Mitchell for the Giants. Sabo scores. I told everybody Chris Sabo had 2 home runs that day.
Listen, some of my best memories were at Riverfront. My wife, we've been almost married now, coming up on 30 years. One of our very first dates was at Riverfront watching the Reds play the Expos. So I have fond memories of Riverfront. And then one of my, I don't know how I convinced this guy to do this. I went to school in Kentucky, about 2.5 hours from Cincinnati. And I realized that Asbury in Wilmore, Kentucky.
Sure,
and so the Reds were playing the Pirates in the 1990 playoffs, and I can't remember what section of the play, like what game it was specifically, but I'm like, I looked at my roommate, I'm like, we don't have a car. We're freshmen in college. How do we get there? So we knew this upperclassman who didn't like baseball but had a car. And I said to him, I go, hey, would you mind driving us to the game? And then just driving around during the game and waiting for us. So he literally did that. He drove us to Cincinnati. We watched the Reds play the Pirates, back in the days where there was Barry Bonds and Bobby Bonilla. And man, it was so much fun to watch. We were in the red seats too. We could have jumped out of the top of the stadium, but it didn't matter. It was so much fun to be there. And then he literally there were no cell phones. So after the game, you can't call him. I said, you're going to have to really just drive around the stadium and we'll just end up here and we'll see you when we see you.
We knew a dad who did that with the All-Star game in '88. They won 2 tickets, but the son wanted to bring his buddy, or maybe it was for the 2 brothers or so. I didn't know the family as well, but the dad did what you're saying. He just basically dropped them off at Riverfront, and then he just had to hang out in Cincinnati for 4 hours or whatever it was. So yeah, that's crazy. All right, so you also talked to someone we have had on Redleg Roundtable, and that was Marty Brennaman. You had Marty on. Marty called Reds games from 1974 to 2019. Just for my money as a Reds fan, I would put him behind Vin Scully, certainly, but I wouldn't put him behind many more. But you got to pick his brain.
What's that? One of the all-time greats. One of the all-time greats. Love him. Yeah.
Yeah. So you got to pick his brain a little bit, and certainly he never called games at Crosley. So we're talking Riverfront, the Great American, but also I remember you asking him, because he grew up down in Virginia, or in North Carolina. Yeah, he grew up in Virginia, I believe, and he went to North Carolina for college. But he talked about going up to Pittsburgh and going to Forbes Field and things like that. So what are your thoughts on your conversation with Marty Brennaman?
Yeah, so his very first game was actually at Griffith Stadium to watch the Washington Senators play the Yankees, and his dad drove him, and I think what was his brother drove them to watch both those games. And this was 1955, and maybe a couple years ago, he's digging through stuff that he found in the attic as they're getting ready to move, and comes across the score sheet from both those days. His dad, he said, had incredible penmanship. And so here's his dad's writing on both those games. He's got both the score sheets, and he talked about just like what a prized possession that was. Again, it's being at your first game and then connecting your past to your present, and that those moments with your dad, especially after he's passed away, and remembering what it was like to just have his undivided attention that day. Yeah, what a special moment. I loved hearing him talk about that.
That is great. So the first game I went to, it was my grandmother's birthday actually, and I remember her keeping score, and that was pretty cool to watch. Like I'd never seen that before, except for little league or t-ball games where the coach was keeping the box, or whatever. But
Yeah.
to be at the game and we've got to get our scorecard, and we might as well buy the pencil too, and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
Well, and you think for Marty, the craziest thing that he said, the first game that he called was, I believe, April 4th, 1974. In the first inning of the first game that he called, Hank Aaron ties Babe Ruth's home run record at 714. And the old left-hander Joe Nuxhall says to him, "I'll be damned, dude. What do you do for an encore after that?" Like, that's his first inning of calling Reds baseball.
Well, and then certainly that year wasn't the best for the Reds, but the next 2 years he calls World Series champions.
Right.
And actually, we had that conversation in 75. The TV network they brought Kurt Gowdy and they brought Marty from the local broadcasts, and they helped broadcast on the TV call of the game. So not only did he get to call the World Series, he did it in front of the entire country.
They don't do that anymore, and I wish they would. I wish they would go back to that.
As well.
Yeah, nobody knows the local team like the local broadcasters. And it would be great to hear them on a national level during the World Series. Talk about
ESPN
this game.
did that. Yeah, about 21 years ago, because I remember it being, I think, around the time the Reds opened Great American Ballpark, and ESPN would bring on the local guy, and Marty got to call. It might have been even Reds Yankees in interleague play, and I stumbled on that on YouTube a little while ago. That was pretty neat. The other thing with Marty was he came very close to. He was an ABA broadcaster. He called Virginia Squires games, and later on he did some Indiana Pacers. But I mean, the sliding doors idea is he could have ended up being an NBA broadcaster and not a Major League Baseball broadcaster, and we certainly would have missed out then. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved his story. I don't know if you remember this about Jerry Park. The Montreal Expos played at Jerry Park while they were building the monstrosity that became Olympic Stadium. And Jerry Park was honestly just like this little neighborhood park. If you ran into it, you would think it wasn't even a minor league ballpark. It looked like a little league field pretty much. But Expos fans loved it. But Marty's first time through Montreal, this would have been 1974, they play a Saturday day game, and after the game's over, Johnny Bench comes up to him and says, "Hey, what are you doing tonight?" And Marty's like, "Nothing. I don't have anything planned." He goes, "You're coming with me." So he takes him to TGI Fridays. Now, Marty's not had anything to eat all day, and he gets Marty hammered, and to the point where he's like, "I got to call you a cab and get you out of here." So Marty goes back to the hotel, and the next day, Marty can't wait to get to Jerry Park. He walks into the clubhouse. Sparky Anderson's there, and he's telling Sparky about this night that he had out with Johnny Bench and all the crazy things they were doing and all the drinks they had. And Sparky gets so mad, he walks to the trainer's table where Johnny Bench is getting worked on. Now, Johnny Bench is sick, and as Marty told in the podcast episode, he's medically ill, not hungover sick. He's got 101 fever. But Sparky doesn't believe it, believes he's hungover, and says, "You're catching the entire game. I don't care if we play 1,000 innings." Well, the game actually goes into extra innings. In the 10th inning, Bench hits a home run to remarkably, still being that sick, hits a home run to win it. But Marty says, "I realized after that, because Bench was so mad at me, that what happens between a player and a broadcaster stays between them. It doesn't go to the manager."
Well, and I've talked to him, and I've talked to Hall of Fame sports writer Hal McCoy as well. He was a Reds beat writer for the Dayton Daily News for about the same period of time that Marty was around the team, and they both talk about those 70s teams because they were similar ages to the players, for one, and for another, things just hadn't evolved to the point yet where there was such a separation. I mean, they flew and stayed with the team a lot of times. And, and Marty especially was close with Morgan and Rose especially. And hung out with them quite a bit. So things are a little different these days. Now, another Reds connection, and honestly, I'm sure you were quite giddy to talk to Johnny Bench, and I was excited to hear it. But you talked to clubhouse, boy and bat boy Warren Brown for an episode, and I've heard of Warren a little bit. He was around during those times in the '70s and got to work for the team and things like that. But some of those insights were almost, I won't say better, but just more unique, I guess, from a different perspective.
Yeah. So when we have the opportunity to have someone on the podcast who is either a clubhouse manager, a bat boy, an organist, honestly, those are the stories that have not been told, that people have not heard, and they bring a unique insight that I don't think you get anywhere else. So Warren Brown, his mom was a nurse and worked at a clinic, and Pete Rose was getting ready to go on a USO tour with Joe DiMaggio, and needed to get a whole series of shots because he was going overseas. So over the course of 2 weeks, he visited this clinic where Warren Brown's mom worked, and they kind of developed a relationship. Well, at the end of the 2 weeks of his shot schedule, Warren's mom says, "Do you think you could get my son a job with the Reds?" And Pete's like, "Yeah, I think I could. And I'll call you when I get back." Sure enough, he goes on this tour. He comes back. He calls and says, "Look for a call from Bernie Stowe, who is the equipment manager for the Reds." And he got the call and he got hired. I mean, who can say, how many can say that, Pete Rose was responsible for their career with the Cincinnati Reds, but Warren can. It was just, again, a super unique story. And he had so many of them. Like, for instance, it was not unusual for a player when they went on the road to have one of the clubhouse kids, one of the clubhouse guys, look after their car and maybe drive it around, keep the gas going. And so Joe Morgan had this beautiful Mercury Marquis that Warren Brown would take home and he would drive to school. And so he said he actually got some dates from that. I mean, imagine you go up to a girl and say, "I don't know if you can see this car back here, but that's Joe Morgan's Mercury Marquis that I'm driving. Would you like to go out and get a hamburger?" Of course you would,
Yep.
So
that's really funny. You mentioned Bernie Stowe. I mean, the Stowe family, that's a whole other thing with these ballparks. Bernie Stowe was with the Reds organization for years and years and years. His son Rick is still the clubhouse guy today.
Is he really?
Yeah. And so, in fact, the two brothers did the visiting in the home. Like, they still, and then even, I think it was Rick's son, he was a ball boy for a few years while he was in college or high school. And it's just, those types of stories are amazing too. I mean, just unreal. Everybody who was a Reds fan knew who Bernie Stowe was, not as much as the players, but they knew who he was, even the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I mean, just unbelievable.
Yeah. Generational.
Yeah, well, and certainly it's a special, I don't know, the responsibility, but also, hard work and things like that, it's got to be almost in the family at that point. One other guy you talked to, and I don't remember this discussion quite as much, but it was Dave Parker. And Dave had most of his career with the Pirates. He had some really good years with the Reds there at the end, or toward the end, but he's from Cincinnati. He grew up there. Not far from Crosley, actually. So I was wondering if you recalled much about your conversation with him.
Yeah, there are a couple of great stories that he told. As you mentioned, Dave Parker I grew up across the street from Crosley Field, and so he was there every day game. And he talks about how he and his buddies would go beyond the left field outfield wall, and there were no bleachers there. So in batting practice, Frank Robinson, it would be nothing for him to hit 15 or 20 balls over the left field wall. So Dave Parker and his friends would keep about half the balls and then sell the other half to kids who were coming later to the game. They also, again, as we mentioned, at Crosley Field, the clubhouse was behind the grandstand on the third base side. So there was a parking lot that separated the grandstand and the clubhouse. And Dave Parker and his friends would just hang out by the players' cars. There was no separate parking lot, for players that was gated and kept fans away. So Frank Robinson and Veda Penson would routinely go to their car. I think they drove like these beautiful white Thunderbirds. And Parker remembers Frank Robinson going to his car, popping the trunk, and Dave saw all these baseballs and different pieces of equipment. And he said, Parker, again, he's not shy. Right. Even as a kid was like, hey, do you have anything in there that I could take? And Frank Robinson ended up giving him a glove and some baseballs. And that was, something that Parker never forgot. But one of my favorite Parker story from that particular episode, when he finished or maybe when he was in 10th grade. And 10th grade, think about this, he's 6'3" or 6'4", 220. So he's a fully grown man. And the Reds are holding an open tryout at Crosley Field. So he's like, I'll do it.
Yeah.
He gets up to the plate. Very first pitch, he hits into the sun deck in right field. Second pitch, he hits it over the Mountain Dew sign in left field and continues to just put on this show. At the end, he picks up his stuff and starts to walk out of the ballpark. And a Red Scout says, hey, where are you going? We want to sign you. And Parker said, you can't sign me. I'm in the 10th grade.
Well, and he was an amazing football prospect as well in high school.
Yeah.
And
could have
so,
played. He probably would have, had he not gotten hurt, he had a leg injury. He probably would have played at Ohio State because he loved Ohio State.
Certainly. I remember hearing that as well. Well, you mentioned Vada Pinson along with Frank Robinson. He was certainly a very underrated player, has over 2,500 hits, was a great player during that era with Frank, and even when Pete came up and things like that. So, well, hey, before I let you go here, I wanted to ask you all your research. Well, two-part question. All your research, what's your favorite ballpark to learn about that you've found something interesting about? But then also, of all the current ballparks, do you have a favorite?
Okay, so the favorite old ballpark, man, that's tough because there's so many great ones that I would love to visit. But there's something special about Forbes Field in Pittsburgh.
Mm-hmm.
You go back and you look at that 1960 World Series where Mazeroski hits the walk-off home run to win the World Series. And you got to remember, in 1960, the Pirates, people believe going into that series, they have no chance to win.
Well, they were massively outscored overall.
Yes, they were. The Yankees were a much better team than the Pirates on paper. But Mazeroski ends up being this hero. And I love that he hits the ball over the left field wall. That outfield wall still exists on the campus of the University of Pittsburgh. There are a group of people who go back there on that date every year to listen to audio of the game and imagine what it was like. And we had Roy Face, who I think is now 90-something, 95, 96, who pitched in that World Series on the podcast a couple of years ago. And Roy told me that after the game was over, all of the players went to go celebrate. But Mazeroski went with his wife. There's a park right beyond the left field wall where the home run landed called Shinley Park. Beautiful park. Again, it still exists. And there are all these park benches. And Mazeroski, rather than go with the team, went there with his wife, sat on a park bench, and just took a deep breath and reflected on what happened and just sat there for an hour and, thought about how much that moment meant. And I love that story and I love that ballpark. Thinking about it now even gives me goosebumps, and just to know that a piece of that outfield wall is preserved so you can actually go there and imagine what it might have been like.
Sure. Hey, in that book I wrote for my son, we were down the left field line in the imagination of being there for that game. And about that time, I said, "Here, Joey," that's my son's name. I said, "Joey, let's go." And he's, "What are you, crazy, Dad? This is intense here." And I go, "No, let's go." And we walked just beyond the left field wall there and waited. And I've seen the film of, I think Yogi Berra's playing left field actually. Of him tracking that ball and that ball going over that big wall. And I said, "Let's go over here." And so we were there when the ball comes. And just my imagination running wild there. Like, I know something's about to happen. Let's go over there. But my son's like, "What are you, crazy? We want to watch the game, And I was like, "No, I think this might pay off."
Oh, that's so great. What a great story.
So how about the current ballparks? Have you been to a lot of them?
Yeah. So I, among my favorite, Camden Yards. I mean, the Camden Yards really began, as Bob Costas talked about in that episode that we had. It was our chance to go back to the future. We were saying goodbye to the concrete donuts, and we were now realizing how much more it would mean to have a stadium or a ballpark that felt like the area it was built into. We've got the B&O warehouse that's in right field, which by the way, when they were initially building that, there were some people who were thinking, let's tear that down. We don't
Yeah.
need that. Can you imagine not having that now? So I love Camden Yards for that reason. Petco Park is another favorite of mine, with the Western Metal Supply building that's
Mhm.
out in left field. And when you walk in that entrance, you actually walk through that old building to get to your seats on the first base side. I'm sorry, on the third base side. So those two would be right at the top of my list. Yeah, for current ballparks that I really enjoy.
Yeah, I've been to San Francisco. That's probably my favorite current ballpark. And you mentioned the getting away from the concrete jungles and things like that. There's a real line in the sand sort of delineation of Toronto Sky Dome at the time, what it was called, and even
Yeah.
New Comiskey when it was built. And you kind of draw that line right there, and then you get Camden Yards, you get Ballpark at Arlington, you get Jacobs Field at the time, and then we're off and running.
Right.
And honestly, most of them, I've been to a lot of them. Most of them are really well done. I could nitpick some things on some of them, but
Yeah.
certainly they're more baseball parks. And like you're saying, like even Philadelphia feels like Philadelphia, right? Citizens
Right.
Bank Park feels like Philadelphia. Um, yeah, and certainly with the riverfront and all that sort of thing, and the Clementi Bridge in Pittsburgh, but the riverfront in Cincinnati and the riverboat that they have out in center field, you can get a feel like you kind of know where you are, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the real important things that's happened in the last 20, 30 years is that architects like Janet Marie Smith, who helped build Camden Yards, who helped redesign a little bit what's happening at Fenway with the green monster seats.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, there's a focus on, again, making it feel like the city that it's in, making it unique and special.
Well, and I'll tell you, at least in Cincinnati, and we Reds fans would like a more competitive ball team on the field a lot of times, but the one thing, especially the Castellini family, since they took over in 2006, has done, that stadium now is probably nicer than when it opened in 2003.
Mhm.
And if you go back to when Riverfront was about to close, Riverfront opened in 1970. The Reds and Bengals never got along. They shared the building. They couldn't agree on who should pay for things. The county maybe didn't do the things it should have done. From 1970 to about 1997, when people started talking about needing a new stadium, that's not that long. Okay. From 1970 to 1997, and the place was falling apart.
Yeah.
And what they've done with Great American Ballpark and what I've seen even out in Colorado, even up in Cleveland, they've done some things to try to be more fan friendly so that you're facing the action more. I think it's a credit to folks, maybe being more fiscally responsible overall too, because we're not just going to build a $500 million stadium every time you say so. But it's really cool to see, in my opinion, especially where I go to most games at Cincinnati. Hey, this stadium still is really nice, and it's actually getting better because of the things they're doing to it.
Well, yeah, Petco Park is now 20 years
Mhm.
old, and it's actually getting better too. They're
Sure.
they're doing they're doing more that, and I agree with you. I think there was a time where you would just see, ballpark would start and be nice, and then, would slowly decline, and there was nothing really that was done to help that. But it's definitely different now, and I love that.
No doubt.
Except for Atlanta. I mean, how long was Turner Field there? 20 minutes, you know?
Well, but you mentioned Olympic Stadium in Montreal. Turner
Yeah,
Field was kind of a make good by the Braves to say, you're having the Olympics here. We'll agree to let you build your Olympic Stadium and then retrofit it for us. And
right.
so, yeah, it didn't open for baseball until 97. I got to go to a game there in 97. Actually, I was just out of high school. And so it opened then. And then, what's it been now? 5, 6, 7 years since they opened the new ballpark up there by,
Right.
further up the road, up where I guess Cobb County maybe is it, where a lot
Right.
more
Yeah. Yeah.
of the people that go to the games actually are.
Yeah.
But I've yet to be there. I've driven by it. It looks on TV and from the outside like more of a baseball ballpark to me too. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
well, Mike, thanks so much for stopping by today. LostBallparks.com is your website. You can see him on Instagram with Lost Ballparks, one word. That's the username. And also the Lost Ballparks podcast. I get it on Apple. You can find it a lot of places, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Spotify. Yeah. Wherever you stream podcasts, you can listen. Just search Lost Ballparks. Yeah.
Mike, I
Yeah.
appreciate it
Listen.
so much. Thanks for taking the time.
Hey, thank you, Seth. I appreciate you, man. Great work.
Well, have yourself a great week, and you are listening to Redleg Roundtable here on the Riverfront.